Hello, my History 461 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is week 4. This is the week that you have a midterm exam to submit. It's 10 questions in all. Each question is worth 30 points essentially. So if you want an A, you have to get 9 out of the 10 questions correct for 270 out of 300. 8 out of 10 gets you a B, which is 240 points, and so on and so forth. You do not get half credit if you pick a right answer and a wrong answer in the same question. So it's open book, it is untimed, it is not tied to anything that's happening in Leo, so you just download it. Use Microsoft Word, Google Docs, whatever you're using to highlight your answers, to write your name on it, because I will take points off if you don't put your name on your paper. I know this sounds really basic, but people don't do it for whatever reason. They just assume I know who they are and that I'm paying attention when I'm downloading stuff and reading it. So it's simple multiple choice. There's no essay involved. Um, Part of that is to make life a little bit easier for me. And part of it is, quite frankly, because you do enough writing and discussions, right? And quite frankly, this course is not designed to help you become better writers. I'd love it if everyone became better writers instead of writing like like they're talking to people casually. But hey, there are limitations to what you can do online. There are limitations what you can do as a professor, I've learned, but I've generally not accepted until recently because I'm older now, and quite frankly, I don't have the energy I used to have to try to make sure that people be better at what they want to do. If you don't want to get better, you don't want to get better, and that's that. So, um, anyway, based on what I've seen so far, though, most of you did really, really well for week 3, right? Based on what I've seen, it's been great to see people really take the historical aspect of what's of change over time seriously, talking about Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, Anna Julia Cooper, and Ida B. Wells slash Ida B. Wells Barnett, um, and activism and things of that nature. Unfortunately, most of you did not really get the third question about what was a factor in keeping African Americans from moving up north en masse. I mean, given everything that's happening during the Jim Crow period, you'd think they'd move up north and just immediately leave. But if you've got 26 million people from southern Eastern Europe and Central Europe settling in New York and Chicago and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Baltimore and New Orleans and all over various parts of the country, places where African Americans otherwise want to work and they can't work there because there's all this excess labor constantly coming in from Europe, then they're not going to get those jobs. It's that simple, right? You you can have all the motivation for wanting to leave, but if where you're going doesn't have a place for you to be there in terms of finding work, in terms of quite frankly finding housing even, then you're probably going to have a hard time on the other end. So that's why you see such small numbers of African Americans moving up north, moving to the Midwest and Chicago prior to the 19 teens, and especially prior to World War One. Once World War One shuts off immigration, once immigration quota laws are passed during and after World War One, great migration can ensue because now you can find work. Now these employers want African Americans to work for them. You know, not as cheaply as immigrant labor would have, but cheap enough, right? Things of that nature. And so, with that migration, with the start of black migration, which that question didn't get answered very well for week 3, even though all the evidence is there to do it for week 3 as it is for week 4. But with week 4, when we're talking about Great Migration, we're talking about the period of roughly between, most people date it around 1915, but you can say 1910. I mean, it's in that decade. So the period between roughly 1910, especially during World War One, up all the way through the 1920s and into 1930 and 31, you've got this massive wave of 1.5 million African Americans moving from the rural South to urban North to the urban Midwest. And of course, you still have the migration of African Americans to southern cities, to Atlanta, to Dallas, to Houston, to New Orleans or Nolens. Let's be honest, or to Birmingham and Memphis and Chattanooga, et cetera, right? So, and there are push and pull factors for that movement. So that brings us to week 4. Push and pull factors. The push was always there. Jim Crow laws and violence were always there to push African Americans out. But there had to be a pull factor. And one of the big pulls is once you find out that you can get a job somewhere, whether it's U.S. Steel as a laborer, walking as a walking around with buckets of stuff, right? Cleaning latrines, sweeping streets, et cetera, et cetera. But you're getting paid a heck of a lot more doing that than you ever could have made as a sharecropper. So much more that even with the higher housing costs, even with the higher cost of food, it's more worth it to go up north than it is to stay where you are. So hence people moving from Mississippi to Chicago. Um, the Langston Hugheses and Richard Wrights of the world. That's exactly what they do during this period. They move up north, and their families do. Um, they moved to New York, they moved to Chicago, they moved to Philly, they moved to Pittsburgh, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Cleveland, Indianapolis, name the city with the exception of Milwaukee. They're moving most of these cities, Milwaukee and Minneapolis, by the way. They get more migration during the second wave of black migration, which happens during and after World War II, which we're several weeks away from talking about. Anyway, but jobs are going to be a pull. The fact that you might have a family member in those cities is help because in some cases you do have a family member in the city, but they're without family because, quite frankly, even though they're making more money, there are not enough jobs for all those people to come up north. Once the job market opens up, switches away from using immigrant labor as the cheap end of labor to using African Americans as the cheap end of labor. That's what is the big pull. Secondarily, the pull, of course, is better education for their kids. For, because, of course, segregated schools are not segregated and separate but equal in terms of funding, as we well know. All the public schools in the South, this is the thing you have to know, all the public schools in the South are severely underfunded. If you went to a poor white school, you might not have had to deal with the same level of underfunding that you had with black schools. But twice of nothing is still nothing, right? So no one is getting a good education in the South. Going to poor, poorly funded schools in Chicago is very different than going to a poorly funded school in the middle of Mississippi or Alabama or Florida, right? Or Georgia. I mean, you're going to get some sort of proper education, even if it's unequal, right? Even with residential segregation, it being unequal. So that's another draw. And not just for kids, draw for adults too. Because quite as it's kept, even though the literacy rate among African Americans has gone up, about 1 in 4 African Americans are still illiterate or semi-literate by the time you get to the 19 teens and 20s. So literacy is still a big part, a big driver for things, in this case for black migration. So there's that. Um, so anyway, but what do I know, right? I've only been teaching this stuff since before some of you were born, and in some cases since you and I might have been since you might have been in your 20s when doing whatever, being in the military while I was working on learning this stuff so I could teach it. And that's how long I've been teaching this stuff. So, 25, 30 years. But, what do I know? I guess the books know more than I do, even though I've probably helped contribute to some of these books. But okay. So there's that. But with that migration, with that push north and pull of jobs, World War One does come to an end. And when the doughboys come home, the mostly white American Expeditionary Force comes home from Europe, they come back to a place where it automatically falls into depression due to the fact that Europe doesn't need American goods anymore. This is not the free trade neoliberal world where free trade exists and there are all these treaties and stuff so that people can trade freely. This is the period where national economies protect themselves, right? Where you have high tariffs on imports. And so all that excess grain, all that excess cotton, all those excess goods that were either going to soldiers who were fighting in Europe or going to other countries that, like the UK, that were going to get food from the rest of the empire because Germans were blowing their ships out of the water for 2 years. Uh, all that stopped. And so that led to a recession. But that wasn't the only reason, especially now that we're in the land of the middle of a pandemic, despite the fact that we're acting like it doesn't exist anymore. The truth of the matter is that there was a Spanish flu pandemic going on at the same time, and that drove people crazy too, right? Just like people have been acting weird and crazy around here. Folks were not particularly happy with having to be fearful of a deadly pathogen while trying to conduct their normal lives. You add that to the mix. You add that to that mix, and what you end up with is what's known as Red Summer. Except the Red Summer wasn't just the summer of 1919. It was a period of time in which, because of black migration, combined with this belief, this fiction that African Americans were stealing white jobs, right, combined with the stressors caused by economic recession and a growing pandemic in the United States that killed anywhere between roughly 675,000 people to about 1.4 million because severe undercount. And by the way, this is the official historical sort of spread here based on epidemiological counts, excess deaths, so on and so forth. So I'm not making this up. But again, you can take what I said and agree or disagree with it because apparently, we're on the same level as professor and student. My years of expertise don't really matter, apparently, when it comes to discussing this stuff. So there you go, right? So, um, but that led to Red Summer in the summer of 2019, where there were nearly 100 race riots across the United States. But these race riots had been going on since there had been race riots going on off and on prior to World War I, but they really pick up in 1917. In East St. Louis, Illinois, there's a race riot and a lot of property destruction. And by definition, a race riot makes it sound like those old X-Men cartoons where the forces of Magneto come up against the forces of Dr. Xavier, right? Mr. Dr. X, right? No, that's not what a race riot is. Race riot is a bunch of really mad white guys, sometimes with white women, usually white guys, a small army of them, sometimes several dozen, sometimes several hundred, sometimes a couple thousand, come into black neighborhoods that they help segregate either by residential segregation or Jim Crow segregation or some combination of the two, and start destroying black property, start burning down houses, start burning down businesses, trying to rape and sexually assault women in some cases, men, because, not everybody's heterosexual here, but, rape is rape. And beat up and kill people, right? That's what happened. Summer of 2019 is the culmination of all that. In cities like Chicago, Red Summer took off because one teenage black boy swam on the white side of of the south side Michigan beach, swam on the wrong side, got beat up. Next thing you know, riot breaks out. Happened in D.C. a week earlier, where race riot broke out because the Washington Post wrote a headline saying Negro man, attacks white woman on an elevator, which never actually happened. They sensationalized a fictional event to the point where several hundred whites from Northwest marched into U Street, what's now U Street Shaw, started burning down black businesses and homes. Blacks who had served in World War One by day three got tired of it and started sniping at these people and killing them. That's when the National Guard finally came in, right? This happened all across in various cities all across the country, right? You know, the ultimate riot of all of these was the race riot in Tulsa in 1921. The Memorial Day weekend in 1921, where the entire Black Wall Street, a section of Tulsa of Greenwood, was burned out. Right, 300 people killed. Probably more than that. Thousands injured. Took 5 years for them to rebuild. People had to move. And so all of that is part of the fact that black folks are doing pretty well once they got out of the South. And when they did too well, white folks got mad and started burning down stuff. So that's what happened, But you know, you can call it economic anxiety all you want. Maybe the economy helped set those conditions, combined with blacks doing better than white people thought they should, and combined with the fact that there's a pandemic going on. But racism's racism, whether or not, does that change? I mean, if you're using, an economic recession as your excuse, then it's an excuse. It's not really a reason. So there's that. The rise of the KKK is actually fueled by black migration too, because blacks are leaving sharecropping. Two-thirds of all sharecroppers are white, right? Poor whites are doing sharecropping, but if blacks are leaving as an option, then whites are going to be mad about that too. And so in the South and in the North, and parts of the North, surprising parts of the North, like Indiana and Connecticut, you start to see the rise of the KKK in the North, and expands to North Indiana and Southern Ohio and Southern Illinois is a real hotbed of KKK activity. There's KKK activity in D.C. There's actually a march in Washington, D.C., right in front of the White House, right in front of Capitol Hill, in 1925. Mind you, black migration to DC actually slows down in this period. It doesn't actually speed up the way it does in the rest in a good portion of the urban north, because DC's technically in the south anyway. But they had a national march in DC in 1925 and tried it again in 1927. Except that white folks in DC didn't really want to put up with that. So there's all kinds of stuff happening around here. But in the midst of all that, because of all this migration, not just of sharecroppers, but of sheer talented people, you have the rise of what's known as the Harlem Renaissance, because they're bringing all of their ideas and culture and heritage with them, and not just, oh, we got to work, oh, we got to take care of our kids and go send them to school, oh, we have to get literate. There's an arts movement that's going on that's sparked because of black migration. The Langston Hugheses of the world, the Alain Locks of the world, the Zora Neale Hurstons of the world, the Nella Larsons of the world are flocking to the city. And influencing people like a young Lena Horne, who lived, part time between New York and Pittsburgh during this period, for instance, or Duke Ellington, here in Washington, D.C. is another, for instance. And so this is a huge arts movement. Yes, it's called a Harlem Renaissance because many of these movers and shakers in the arts and music and acting and so on are living in New York. But this movement hits every city. It affects every black community in every city, every major city in the United States, and some minor ones. Whether we're talking about the Hill District in Pittsburgh, or the South Side of Chicago, or Harlem and other parts of the city, or Flatbush, where there's a burgeoning black population there, or the South Bronx, where there's an integrated community with new black migrants moving in those spaces, where you're talking about West Philadelphia, or yes, that West and North Philadelphia, where there are substantially growing black populations there too. You see this movement of poetry, of prose, of thinking about the realities of living a segregated life when you're under the hot fire of racism on a systemic and individual and otherwise on a day-to-day basis. So the Harlem Renaissance is sparked by this movement, sparked by the movement of this talent. And a lot of the ideas that we still grapple with today in black literature and black history, in poetry, in music, come out of this period. People talk about the jazz age and the rise of jazz, but the truth is most black migrants brought the blues with them, right? That's just a for instance, right? And the blues might not be as cultured as the wonderful movements of Duke Ellington's band or Louis Armstrong. All of that jazz is influenced by blues, all of it. And so you see a spark of the blues too. People like Blind Willie Johnson and Robert Johnson, who playing, the blues in the 1920s and 30s. That's part of this. The stuff that cultured people don't talk about, right? Blues, because blues is a culture, but blues is important. Blues is the language, is the musical language of migrants. Just as another for instance, right? Of course, there's the arts movement and photography, right? And the paintings of the migration that take place in this period, right? So all of that is sparked by this movement, by the literal movement, people protesting with their feet and leaving the South kind of movement. You don't get the civil rights movement that comes, the official civil rights movement that comes later, and the burgeoning civil rights movement that's going on in this period without black people leaving the South. There's certainly movement, but there's nothing happening with that movement because people can't use their right to vote until they move up north, for example. People can't really join the NAACP until they move up north, for example. That doesn't mean white people want it. The black folks there, we know by the race riots that they did it. But because Jim Crow does not exist in for the most part, once you get to the Midwest, the cities in the Midwest, the cities of the Northeast, it allows a degree of freedom to protest conditions, to protest what's going on in the South, to advocate on behalf of your cousin, your mom, your dad, your son, your daughter who stayed, right? And so voting is this is an opportunity to vote, and for black women it's an opportunity to vote too, because with the 19th Amendment they have the right to vote too, and they can exercise it in a place like Chicago or in a place like New York or even in Pittsburgh. So this is big. This is a game changer. This is a game changer that doesn't really reverse itself until about 20, 25 years ago, when you actually start seeing black folk move back south to cities like Atlanta and Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston, and New Orleans, and other cities. So let me stop there. If you watch and listen this far, that's great. If you didn't, well, that's par for the course. I'm kind of used to the reality that I'm just a customer service worker to some of y'all, so it's okay. I'm just trying to reach as many students as I can. Have a good week.